Pleasant evening to everyone gathered here. I am Muhammad Tariq, interns team of Biodiversity Conservation Foundation. We all have one goal, that is to conserve nature. More say, to not disturb its wilderness. We as a human being who coexist with ecosystem, we aren't fixers. Instead, we strive to make sure nature's true potential doesn't get lost in the new world. Their exceptional resilience being their true potential, we as a team aspire to create a world where the environment doesn't need protection. The Biodiversity Conservation Foundation of India as a team ensure passionate involvement towards conservation of wildlife and natural resources. Our team also works in creating awareness among common people and drive young minds towards conservation. We strongly believe that awareness is the major factor that helps people understand the natural world and diverge them from mistreating it. With more than 40 webinars, collaborating experts from around the globe, this platform connects the volunteers holding various degrees of environmental knowledge varying from low to high with international experts. The team actively held numerous webinars about the biodiversity of water, land, air, even during the lockdown, ensuring the conservation and awareness carried out stays independent of pandemic. And of course, our journey doesn't stop here. We extend our role that various research-based studies and on-field conservation measures. We actively encourage young minds and involve them in projects that can nurture their knowledge and skill. Our team has grown tremendously ever since the establishment of BCF India. Today is yet another day where we tell ourselves that protecting the planet, ending poverty, and maintaining peace cannot be done by a single government or organization. I welcome you all once again for international webinar on making sustainable development integrated approaches to achieve the 2030 agenda. Over to you, my team member, Ms. Marina Johnson, for introducing about today's honorable speaker, Mr. Michael Stanley Jonas. Thank you.
Good evening to all. Today it's milestone in BCF International Webinar. On behalf of BCF India, I, Marina Johnson, intern of BCF, privileged in introducing our today's speaker, Mr. Michael Stanley Jones, Program Management Officer, United Nations Environment Program. He completed his Bachelor's of Arts from St. John's State University, California, and Masters of Arts in Politics from the Claremont Graduate University, California. From 1992 to 1995, he was Civic Education Project Visiting Lecturer in Thomas Messerk University in Czech Republic in the Department of Social Work and Social Policy. From 1996 to 1998, he was Educational Technology Specialist in Education Access in California. From 1998 to 2003, he served as manager in Sustainable Water Program in Silicon Valley Toxis Coalition, California. From 2003 to 2004, he served as California State Director in Clean Water Action, San Francisco. From 2004 to 2009, he was Environment Affairs Officer in Secretariat of the Aarhus Convention of United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. From 2009 to 2014, he worked as Public Information Officer, Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, UNEP. Since 2014, Michael is serving as Program Management Officer in United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, Kenya. He is responsible for communications, knowledge management, and reporting at Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development Goals, a joint global project of UNDP and UNEP based in Nairobi. He plans, organizes, and manages the preparation of ecosystem integration branch communications and outreach, including for the Integrated Ecosystems Management Partnership, Regional Seas Program, and UNDP-UNEP Poverty Environmental Initiative. He is co-secretary of United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion and has advocated for engagement with the textile and apparel industries on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. He is also UNEP authorized representative to the Eastern and Southern Africa Trade and Development Bank. He also served as an expert advisor during negotiation of the Danube River Protection Convention in 1994 and the Key Protocol on Pollutant Release and Transfer Registers in 2003. He has published various research articles and has done various projects too. Within developed nations and new democracies, he is an accomplished leader and advocate for social change, tackling poverty, equality, and environmental justice. BCF is happy in connecting the eminent professionals, stakeholders, students, and public on this international webinar during this COVID-19. We are delighted to connect our eminent speaker, Mr. Michael Stanley Jones, Program Management Officer, United Nations Environment Program, on this virtual forum and waiting to listen on the beautiful webinar. Over to you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I feel I've lived my life twice now, having toured my previous assignments. But just to summarize that life, I did not join the United Nations until I was 46 years old. So I had several career turns before then as an academic, as a business person, and as a community organizer, which eventually I brought all of those experiences to support the work of the United Nations. I will share my prepared remarks with the organizers, and thank you to Biodiversity Conservation Foundation for this invitation. So if you would like a copy, including the references, which I think are very important for many of the statistics and many of the claims in my intervention today, you can have those from the organizers. The fundamental connection between poverty reduction and the environment has grown ever more apparent as poor people's lives and livelihoods continue to be threatened by environmental degradation resulting from poor management of natural resources, biodiversity loss, and the effects of climate change. Indeed, now we can speak of the climate crisis. Every year between 1994 and 2013, 218 million people, most of them in developing countries, were affected by natural disasters on average per year, especially from floods and droughts. In 2019, 396 natural disasters were recorded, with 11,755 deaths, 95 million people affected, and 103 billion US dollars in economic losses across the world. This burden was not equally shared, as Asia suffered the highest impact and accounted for 40% of natural disasters, 45% of deaths, and 74% of the total number of people affected. India was hit hardest and recorded nearly 20% of total deaths in 2019, 24.5% of the total number of people affected. In comparison with the previous decade, from 2009 to 2018, in 2019, there were more disasters compared to the average annual number of 343 events. Yet, fortunately, fewer deaths compared to the annual average over the previous decade of 45,000 deaths. Populations in low and lower middle income countries face the global mortality risk from natural disasters, and their countries suffer disproportionately higher economic losses relative to the size of their economies. Recognizing these challenges, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, held in Brazil in June of 2012, the Rio +20 conference, highlighted the need for integrated solutions to development planning and a transition to a more resource-efficient, resilient form of growth that yields multiple social, economic, and environmental benefits. The Rio +20 outcome document, The Future We Want, adopted by the 193 UN member states, notes that sustainable development, which integrates economic, social, and environmental dimensions, is the only viable path for development. In The Future We Want, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio +20, recognized that, quote, eradicating poverty is the greatest global challenge facing the world today and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2015, recognized that an integrated approach is needed to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. As governments identify the content and priorities of their 2030 Agenda for Development, the relationship between poverty reduction and environmental and natural resource sustainability must be a central objective. Poor people depend on the environment for their livelihoods and well-being. Improved management of the environment and natural resources contributes directly to poverty reduction, more sustainable livelihoods, and pro-poor growth. To fight poverty, promote security, and preserve the ecosystems that poor people rely on for their livelihoods, we must place pro-poor economic growth and environmental sustainability at the heart of our economic policies, planning systems, and institutions. To tackle this challenge, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, joined hands and launched the Poverty Environment Initiative in 2005, and then renewed their collaboration in 2018. The Poverty Environment Initiative was a global UN program that helped countries to integrate poverty environment linkages into national and subnational development planning, from policymaking to budgeting, implementation, and monitoring. With both financial and technical support, UNDP and UNEP assist government decision makers and a wide range of other stakeholders to manage the environment in a way that improves livelihoods and leads to sustainable growth. The initiative works with key government partners to raise awareness, influence policymaking, and strengthen the mainstreaming of poverty environment into budget processes, sector programs, and subnational planning. The overall aim is to bring about lasting institutional change and to catalyze key actors to increase investment in pro-poor environmental and natural resource management. Poverty Environment Initiative concluded in 2018 when it was succeeded by a new joint program, Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development Goals, 2018 to 2022. So if you look at the arc of these two joint programs of UNDP and UNEP, they began in 2005 and they are forecast to continue until 2022. The new action program is built on the following shared understanding of where we stand at the opening of the third decade of the 21st century. First, eradicating poverty is an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. Although the Millennium Development Goal Target 1 of halving extreme poverty has been met, 836 billion people, nearly 9% of the global population, still lived in poverty at the end of the MDG era in 2015. Progress has been slower at higher poverty lines. In all, 2.2 billion people lived on less than $2 US per day in 2011. The average poverty line in developing countries and another common measurement of deep deprivation. That is only a slight decline from the 2.59 billion people who lived in deep deprivation in 1981. While many may have escaped extreme poverty, the gains are easily reversible. And we have now seen evidence of that in the COVID-19 crisis. The 2030 Agenda recognizes that poverty is multidimensional and comes in different forms. The achievement of the interrelated Sustainable Development Goals and their 169 targets will depend on the ability and willingness of countries and their development partners to harness those linkages. 2, economic growth alone will not eradicate poverty. Economic growth is a necessary component, but by itself, it will not eradicate poverty. Globally, the number of people living in extreme poverty has declined by more than half, falling from 1.9 billion in 1990 to 836 million in 2015. While absolute poverty has fallen, nearly a billion people still live on less than $1.25 per day US. Even if all countries grow at the same rates as they have over the past 20 years, and if the income distribution remains unchanged, world poverty will only fall by 10% by 2030, from its baseline of 17.7% in 2010. The conclusion is, ending poverty requires more than growth. Third, the geography of poverty is changing. The gains we have made in reducing poverty have not been evenly shared. The overwhelming majority of people living on less than $1.25 per day reside in 2 regions, Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and they account for about 80% of the global total of extremely poor people. More than 40% of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, still lived in extreme poverty in 2015. In Sub-Saharan Africa, more than 60% of the rural population lives on less than $1.25 per day, and almost 90% live on less than $2 a day, leaving them vulnerable to economic downturns and other external shocks. Most poor people today live in middle-income countries, but in 10 years, poverty will become more concentrated in more fragile, least developed countries facing conflicts and climate stress. Moreover, the urban population of the world is expected to increase by more than 2/3 by 2050, with nearly 90% of the increase to take place in the urban areas of Africa and Asia. While poverty today remains primarily rural, the share of urban poverty has increased to 28%, in part due to rural-urban migration. Up to 80% of some urban populations living in slums. It's notable that in my home, in Nairobi, Kenya, the majority of the population lives in informal settlements, slums. Fourth, inequality harms growth, poverty reduction, and ecosystem sustainability. Household income inequality shows a rising trend from the early 1990s to the late 2000s in most countries. Income inequality increased by 11% in developed countries between 1990 and 2010. This long increase in income inequality has curbed economic growth significantly. Lower inequality is robustly correlated with faster and more durable growth. Inequality exacerbates the problem of creating and maintaining accountable government, increasing the probability of economic and social policies that inhibit growth and poverty reduction. 70% of the world's poor depend on natural resources for all or part of their livelihoods. Ecosystem services and other market goods make up between 50 and 9% of the total source of livelihoods among poor, rural, and forest-dwelling households worldwide. The so-called GDP, the gross domestic product of the poor. Moreover, poverty falls disproportionately on women. Of the 1.2 billion people across the world who are going hungry each day, 7 out of 10 of them are women and girls. A significant majority of the world's estimated 1 billion rural women depend on natural resources and agriculture for their livelihoods, making them more vulnerable to negative impacts of environmental degradation and climate change. Fifth, poverty, environment, climate, and gender mainstreaming helps eradicate poverty, reduce inequality, and combat environmental degradation. We'll talk more during our discussion on what we mean by poverty, environment, climate, and gender mainstreaming. But to begin, the sustainability of the environment, once mistakenly thought to compete with economic development, is now understood to be complementary and necessary to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, goal 1 of the 2030 Agenda. Economic development and poverty reduction strongly depend on improving management of the environment and natural resources, the natural capital of the poor. New tools of economic analysis and transparency reveal the true value of natural capital and sustainable management of natural resources. And these can mobilize support among decision makers for poverty environment mainstreaming within the government. To ensure benefits gained through the Poverty Environment Initiative and action are sustained, international, regional, and national institutions need to embrace poverty environment mainstreaming within their own organizations and practices. Sixth, the integrated approach to poverty reduction and environmental sustainability pioneered by the Poverty Environment Initiative and then continued through Poverty Environment Action can support governments to design both the process and the content of Sustainable Development Goal implementation. Successful implementation of the SDGs will require doing things differently. A business as usual approach will not succeed. Governments will need technical and financial support to clarify the content and implications of the Sustainable Development Goals in the national context, prioritize and prepare effective implementation plans for the 2030 Agenda. And indeed, Poverty Environment Action, the program I work for at present, is working to localize the Sustainable Development Goals in partnership with national governments. Poverty Environment Action's integrated approach to policy and strategy development and implementation plays a vital role in developing countries' efforts to implement the SDGs at national and sub-regional level. Presently, Poverty Environment Action works in 11 countries. Poverty Environment Initiative supported efforts in 28 countries, and the sustainability of those efforts are adding and adding to the value of this integrated approach. By taking pro-poor, gender-responsive environment and climate issues into the heart of economic decision-making, in particular, national and subnational planning and budgeting processes and investments, poverty can continue to be reduced while safeguarding the environment and tackling climate change and inequality. The ongoing COVID-19 crisis has dramatically reminded us of how even the tiniest life forms can wreak immense damage in our world. This pandemic is likely to influence social, economic, and environmental outcomes for years or even decades to come. The COVID-19 pandemic is the most serious existential threat to both lives and livelihoods in modern history, and poses a huge challenge to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It has had a devastating impact on vulnerable economies, especially those in the global south. According to the latest United Nations estimates, the COVID-19 pandemic could tip as many as 132 million more people across the planet into chronic hunger by the end of 2020. The worst effects are expected to be experienced by the world's poorest and most vulnerable groups, including subsistence and smallholder farmers in developing countries. Approximately 80% of all people suffering from hunger live in rural areas, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization. Natural disasters and climate hazards negatively affect food systems and increase livelihood risks and food emergencies. For countries in the global south, a lack of early warning systems, insufficient disaster preparedness, a low level of emergency response, and poor reconstruction and recovery strategies make already hazard-prone victims suffer the greatest consequences. Addressing world leaders in October of 2020, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres observed that COVID-19 is costing the global economy $375 billion a month. Since the crisis started, more than 500 million jobs worldwide have been lost, and vulnerable families have migrated from urban back to rural areas. Several initiatives within the UN system promote an integrated approach on the ground. These include within UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, Nature-Based Solutions, TEEB, which stands for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, Poverty Environment Action for Sustainable Development Goals, the joint initiative that I'm affiliated with, and PAGE, the Partnership for Action on Green Economy. And lastly, let me mention the flagship program of the International Ecosystem Management Partnership on Climate, Ecosystems, and Livelihood. That's a partnership based in Beijing and includes UNEP and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And we are collaborating with them on food security and poverty elimination in our branch, the Ecosystems Integration Branch. As we seek to recover momentum for advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, integrated approaches such as these will continue to be vital to the 2030 Agenda's ultimate success. Thank you for your time and attention, and I would welcome discussing these propositions and developments and trends with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. I request all participants, you can kindly interact with our eminent speaker. So whatever the queries and clarifications, kindly you can introduce yourself, you can ask your questions. Thank you, Mr. Michael.
As you're preparing your thoughts and coming with questions, I'll just mention that the United Nations is a very dynamic organization. And I have just recently moved on from serving as co-secretary of the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. I've stepped down from that role and taken up a new role to be focal point for my branch for ecosystems integration on digital transformation. So thank you for those kind words, but in fact, I've now evolved into a new kind of support officer, helping my organization with digital transformation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir,
yeah, please, you can ask.
Sir, what do you feel about, what are your thoughts on the United States withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, the Paris Summit?
Yeah, there is a national election tomorrow. It actually has already been in play for many weeks with over 97 million votes already cast. And since last summer, we've received reports that transition planning is well underway. So if there is a new government, a wholly new government, and we must wait for the results of the election to find out if that is the case, it is widely expected that the proposed withdrawal from the World Health Organization, which is not yet a fact, it is a 12-month process for a member of WHO to withdraw, that decision would be reversed. The decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement would also likely be overturned. So we cannot forecast. We don't know what the American people will decide. But if you wait a few days or a week, these issues will become much clearer. And I believe multilateralism will return in the near future as a leading strategy for addressing global issues like the climate crisis, like the biodiversity crisis, and like the pollution crisis. So let's wait and see how things develop. Every member state of the United Nations is a sovereign country. Each has its own culture, its own economy, its own traditions, and as an officer of the United Nations, we respect the decisions of the peoples of those member states, and we support them in whatever way we can. So they are my bosses. India is my boss equally as is United States. There's no favoritism. In our secretariat, we serve everyone equally and fairly, we hope. So let's wait and see if the multilateral system will again be strengthened as Secretary General Guterres has called for. We have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, agreed by consensus of all 193 member states. And we now have more than 15 years of experience applying integrated approaches to address natural resource management and poverty jointly. And so building on that, we think the experiences of sustainable development and ecosystems management can be shared globally using the multilateral structures. Thank you.
So just as a sort of follow-up, it's not really a question. I just want to say that I really like your shirt.
Well, thank you. It's a shirt designed in Nairobi by a fashion designer who specializes in what's called upcycled fashion. So these are remnants of other designs that he's patched together. No, I take that back. This is actually a shirt made in Kibera, a slum in Nairobi, but by a young designer. But I have many examples of this because in Kenya I work with the Kenyan Fashion Council and we support sustainable design.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Michael. And also I have a stories. In the Sustainable Development Goal in point number 15, life on land. So and also in 17, partnership for the goals. In these two aspects, in many of the places, especially where we are sitting in Tamil Nadu, we face many problems towards nature. For example, due to whatever your presentations you mentioned, due to natural calamities, we face many problems, especially in road depressions and cyclones. Many of the peoples, they lost their life entirely, even in agriculture field, as well as in the cultivations of whatever in the large tree, even coconut or else mango, some of the jackfruit, likewise the big farm, they lost their life totally. So in these aspects, whether the UN is directly involved to help this kind of farmers?
Yes, we were very pleased to see the Nobel Prize go to our sister agency, World Food Program, for the help they have given and the leadership of their program. But speaking specifically about ecosystems integration branch, we have examples of partnering with the national authorities to strengthen, for example, soil management practices in Malawi. And I think we can use this as an example of what it means to be using an integrated approach. Soil management losses were tied to the divorce between women-owned and women-led farms in Malawi. The majority of farms, smallholder farms, are led by women. And the kind of management knowledge and resources that they had not accessed previously. So working over a number of years through scientific and economic analyses, studies, we identified ways the government could make their agricultural policy gender sensitive and provide more access to information and training and skills development to women farmers, who then applied these to improve the productivity of the smallholder farms that they managed, thereby using the soil, natural resource, more eco-efficiently, and at the same time raising smallholder farm incomes. So this is an example to address what seems like an issue of environmental resource management, soils, or of economic management, farming. It required that we address gender equity issues in the country. So we brought those three communities together, and we've worked now in 5 sub-Saharan African countries with the UN Women program and FAO, and with the World Bank in the analytical phase of this work, to document how integrated approach to agricultural policy that is gender sensitive can support greater climate resilience, greater resilience to these shocks, COVID being the latest shock, but the cyclical shocks of drought, of flooding, of cyclones. Just to mention Mozambique, one country we worked in, suffered a tremendous damage in a cyclone a little over a year ago. So we are constantly aware that we need to integrate and join forces across the UN family and with national leadership to help local people, farmers and smallholders and women-led farms to become more resilient. Your volume, I can't hear you, please.
Thank you for your detailed information. And also we tried in many of the places, either two aspects we suffered in, especially in South India. Majority, they lost their agriculture field, all the crops, as well as in cash crops like big trees, as well as in value timber trees. But in the same second aspects, whatever the entire landscape more than 100 square kilometer, we lost all the green cover. Even core jungle also we lost the green cover. There is no green cover due to that Gaja cyclone, that their post Gaja cyclone. After entering our field survey, whatever that happens in the field, we come to know there is no such a big trees that is not able to stand in their cultivable field as well as in the forest. So in these situations, our intention BCF India is a plan to, we need to bring back green cover. So whatever we lost, we need to bring back. In this aspect, whether we need some of the help from our colleague friends and other aspects, many of you and people also. Maybe you can give some light through about what are the aspects, whether UN can be able to collaborate and work in the field of wherever we lost our green cover. You can kindly give some points on that.
Sorry for that. Just briefly to give a few ideas and suggestions. Although United Nations Environment Program is considered and is called a non-resident program, that means we don't have country offices in most of the 193 member states. We are not like United Nations Development Program, which does have country offices. But the exception is in India, we have a UNEP India program office. So that's the first bit of good news. Secondly, we have a major initiative in sub-Saharan Africa, which may be relevant and provide relative experience and models. And that is the Great Green Wall that is being built through replanting and making communities more resilient against desertification. So loss of green cover is relevant experience for desertification. So there's just two suggestions there. We believe in partnerships in UNEP because we are a relatively small agency, very small. You know, I often make the comparison that we are about 1/10 the size of one of the major global fast food hamburger chains. So if you can imagine, we're dwarfed by these companies making Big Macs and other types of sandwiches, who employ far more people and have greater resources than even our agency. Although we are the global leaders and stewards of the UN system on the environment, we really are very, very thinly stretched. So that means partnerships are crucial if we're going to deliver our expertise and our knowledge to member states, and especially if we're going to reach local communities and deal with local natural resource management issues. How can we do it when we only have approximately 800 full-time officers? And the answer is through initiatives like Poverty Environment. We have, first of all, joined forces with UN Development Program, which does have country offices in each country where we operate. So I mentioned that we currently have 11 countries in our catchment, that previously we had 28 countries. There's some overlap between those two, but in all, approximately 50 countries have been touched by this program over the past 15 years. And it has been crucial to make that partnership with the UN Development Program. We also have partnered with, for example, the Bureau of Statistics in Bangladesh, with UN Women in Malawi, and with other development partners in other countries and other contexts. And that helps us land the lessons we've learned and the dissemination of the techniques and methodologies that we have, for example, in budget tagging for climate expenditure. Or another example, how to do an economic analysis and poverty reduction analysis if a certain investment is made by the government or by a bilateral donor in a certain program. We're providing this analytical work which motivates the ministries and the national executives to choose to invest for poverty reduction through environmental sustainability. One other, and it may seem banal, but it's actually a crucial strategy that we have. Normally, natural resource issues are dealt with by ministries or departments of natural resources and environment, ministries of environment, or Department of Forest Management, for example. And it's just our observation that these are not always the strongest actors in government decision-making at national level. Stronger actors are, for example, ministries of finance or ministries of planning and development. They have more resources and they have perhaps closer to the seats of power, more time and attention given by the national executives to the Minister of Finance than to the Minister of Environment, unfortunately, or fortunately. It's really their decision. But that led us to conclude that the way to make the greatest impact was actually to put our expert hired by the government in the Ministry of Finance or in the National Planning Agency, rather than in the Ministry of Environment, and let them network across ministries. So-called coherence and coordination is the way that we've made our impact stronger. And in this way, working with the executive, working with the sustainability councils in countries that set up those types of interagency bodies, or working with planning authorities, we're able to give for example, a planning guidance document, the poverty environment treatment, if you will, to make sure that it is sensitive to natural resource and guides investment in natural resource management. And those budget documents, those planning documents, then become the models for localization. So district development planning, for example, in Tajikistan or in Rwanda, is heavily influenced by those model national planning documents that have instilled poverty, environment, and gender mainstreaming and climate mainstreaming into their guidance. So that's another way of influence, so that it can actually make an impact on the ground. We also do case studies at district level, for example, in Indonesia, for climate investment. So we pick a locality that looks promising and has challenges like the ones you've described: loss of mangrove trees and shoreline erosion and salination of local wells, this type of issue. And then we test our techniques such that they can then be they could be disseminated using the evidence that we gather from those case studies, those model projects. Lastly, we've done a lot of work with analyzing national budget expenditures. So we created budget tagging of climate and natural resource investment. It turns out that if the government is not tracking its investment in these areas, they're likely also underinvesting in these areas. So if we can provide both a tracking system that shows the government what are you investing of your budget, of your national income in these important strategic areas of sustainable development, and what benefits could you accrue if you made those investments, if you close the gap in investment. So for 1/10 of 1% of your global of your gross domestic product, for example, if you invest that much, will you get a 0.3% increase in your national income? This kind of analysis. And that turns out to be highly motivating for the economists and the financiers who tend to populate those ministries of finance. They want to be shown the numbers in order to be convinced that natural resource investment is worth the medal, is worth the effort. And that's been a big success story for our joint programming.
Good evening. I am Professor Satyanarayana from Chennai, India. It's a very nice presentation. No, my concern is regarding the forest fires, maybe natural or man-made forest fires are there.
Forest fires.
Yeah. So what happened in most of the countries, they think that there will be natural and at the same time man-made. So in most of the developed countries also, there are the fires because of the man-made. So because they say in the name of development, but maybe their main aim is that to just once the forest fires are there, they're cleared, they want to have an industry. Now, what is your sustainable, we talk about sustainable development. So you encourage such industries coming up after the forest fires. So what is your reaction for this? This is one of the natural artificial.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. It is a topic I'm personally passionate about, and we discussed about a month ago in this forum. My homeland is the northern part of the state of California, and California, of course, has suffered from horrific wildfires for much of the past decade, including one that burned to the doorstep of my father's home. Fortunately, the firefighters saved his home. 95% of the homes in Paradise, California, a town of 27,000 people, 95% of structures were destroyed in the wildfire of last year. And the wildfires continue. And so it is a personal issue. But beyond that, I've given much thought to this initial question: is it a natural phenomenon or is it a man-made phenomenon? And as a social scientist, I'm acutely aware of what's called the urban wildlands interface, to use the language in California. That is the boundary between urban settlement population settlement and wildlands where fires are a natural phenomenon. California suffers every year from dry lightning storms, so no rainfall, but you have lightning, and these lightning strikes in the highlands, in the foothills, in the mountain areas, they ignite fires. So that's one natural cause of wildfires, which are part of the ecosystem of California. But over the decades, the population has moved from urban areas, from the metropolitan areas, into the foothills, into the wildlands, into nature, and has lost the barrier, if you will, that kept those fires from impacting property and impacting human lives, as they now do with horrific results. So the fire's source in this case is natural, but the impact on the society is not natural. It is social, and it is driven by patterns of settlement, which is ultimately a function of economics. Property values are so high in Silicon Valley, where I am from. I'm from Cupertino, California, San Francisco, California. So we are, one of the epicenters, as India also is an epicenter of the high-tech industry. And land prices have become unaffordable for 95% of the population. You cannot purchase a home, you can barely rent an apartment, space is at a premium, and that forces the working population further and further out into the countryside, looking for low-cost habitation. So that's a social economic phenomenon, and it is increasing the risk. There's another risk of this closure or loss of the space between urban settlement and wildlands, and that is zoonosis. The fact that populations are increasingly contacting the wildlife, and the wildlife markets are penetrating urban centers. We've seen the consequence of that, which is an increased passage of zoonotic diseases from wildlife to the human population, as COVID-19 is strongly believed to have originated in wildlife population. So that's another thing to keep our eyes on. It's not a purely natural phenomenon that we are suffering the pandemic we are today. It is our responsibility to respect nature and to try to keep a healthy balance or distance from wildlife that can threaten us with these types of infections. So back to your question about wildfires. It is a combination of natural and human-made. So I tend to think of this as an emergent phenomenon. It's not natural, it's not purely human-made, it's emergent, because we learn over history how the changing patterns of our settlement, of our interactions with nature, is causing changes in society, and in this case, with terrible consequences. We also know, of course, that climate heat is induced by greenhouse gas emissions that are humanly produced. They are the artifact or the consequence of our consumption of fossil fuels at unsustainable rates. And that is causing things like the wildfires we saw in the Siberian, in the tundra, which is unfortunately also destroying land cover and exposing, through the increased temperatures, the release of gases that have been locked in soils for millennia. So again, it's not nature's fault that they have these carbon sinks naturally in tundra, but it is our responsibility to respect that and to support policies that will keep carbon locked away so it does not become a greenhouse gas that will again accelerate the temperature increases. So yeah, I think this emergent phenomenon is something that we need to be more sensitive to, and we need to understand its complexity. It's not all natural and it's not all man-made, but it is very, very real.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah,
Sir,
please.
what do you think about the US and the Europe exporting used cars to Africa, which is worsening the air pollution over there?
I missed one part. What was the item that you wanted to comment the export on?
Yeah. What do you think about the US and Europe exporting the used cars to
Oh,
Africa,
used cars.
which is
Yeah.
worsening the air pollution over there?
And I think the issue there is that these cars do not meet the standards of their domestic markets. They are banned in the United States and banned in Europe because of their high pollution and low performance in many cases. So just today, I read a report by Inger Anderson, her monthly report to the UNEP staff. She is the executive director of the United Nations Environment Program. And Ms. Anderson was commenting on this issue and how it is being addressed, supported by our agency. So we now have in West Africa an agreement among governments to stop this trafficking of used cars because of their poor environmental performance. So that's the strategy we have at UNEP. We help member states understand the issue. We make the global community aware of the impacts, the negative impacts on the populations of Africa, and then member states can choose to do differently. So that's the hopeful sign there. But you know, this is not solely an issue of cars. I used to work for the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, which are the three leading global treaties addressing chemicals and chemicals in trade that are hazardous and also hazardous waste. And this issue returns again and again and again. Developed countries exporting their waste or exporting their products, which are no longer permitted in their domestic markets for sale to regions and countries that do not have the same level of controls, and therefore putting those countries and their peoples at risk. So there are instruments in global law that are stopping this type of trade, or at least providing tools so countries can make what are called prior informed consent decisions, that is, that they agree to make, having already understood what the hazards and risks are. So an example of this is the Rotterdam Convention on the prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade. So that does not ban the trade, but it requires that signatories to this, that as parties to this global treaty, share with each other information about the properties and hazards associated with these types of pesticides and other chemicals, so that the countries themselves, once they have the information, they can make their own choices about what to import and what to reject. Another example, more recent example, would be the trade in used clothing. So,
So,
very hot issue. Yes, please.
so we all know that the entire world has been really badly affected because of the coronavirus pandemic. So in your opinion, how has India handled the situation? Could it have been better, or somewhere have we lacked somewhere, in controlling the cases?
I'm perhaps not qualified or informed how India has handled or not handled. Um, so I'm afraid I wouldn't give an opinion. I wouldn't give information in commenting on this, because I have not followed the course of the virus in India. I have followed it in Kenya, where I work to support the development of masks. We helped share information about the standards of sanitation that should be used for face masks with the Kenyan fashion community that was in dialogue with the Kenyan Ministry of Industry. And we even brought forward from the UN designs that were suggested to be, very highly protective. So, but that is really the limit of my experience on COVID response. I am now I'm speaking to you today from Czech Republic, where I'm visiting family, and where we live, my wife and I. And the Czech Republic has just announced further strengthening of the lockdown. So I have some information about my own situation, my family situation in my homelands. In California, my family even suffered from COVID infection. One member of the family has fortunately recovered fully. But that said, I don't have any particular information about how things have gone in India. I hope things are going well or better. We are in Europe in the so-called second wave, and cases have been rising until quite recently. Average daily cases have been spiking, but with new controls, we now see the numbers begin to dip. So that's really the limit of what I could say, just to describe the course, but I don't have any expertise in this particular field. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michael.
One more thing, Mike, say regarding the zoonotic diseases, you are commenting on that zoonotic diseases from the wildlife to man. But actually, I think we do not have evidence still. So the studies are not, it's underway. I think there is no confirmed report with regard to the transmission of the COVID or other disease from the wildlife to the, and in such cases, the domestic animals might have got the COVID or other virus. I think so far we are not sure of whether the COVID has transmitted from the wild to the pastoral life. I think is there any studies or evidence from US or other countries? As far as my concern, I don't think there is some evidences the transmission of the diseases, especially the COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you raise a very important issue, and that is the circulation of the diseases among animal husbandry, among pig farms, for example, where we know there are large populations of pigs that are slaughtered for pork consumption, that are also harboring these viruses. So, and in fact, even the pet population, cats, for example, are known to have caught COVID. There was famously 2 tigers at the Bronx Zoo in New York City who caught COVID. So it is quite a question. But again, it goes back to our relationship to nature. Are we the stewards of these animals? Are we properly managing the social distance, the natural social distance needed between animal populations and humans? Or are we bringing them into our homes, into our kitchens, into our lives in ways that might, increase our risks?
Nice.
Yeah, very nice explanations.
Hello.
Yes, hello. Thank you. Hello, this is Linda. I am also enthusiastic about sustainable development, and I love geospatial technologies. And I'm wondering, when it comes to sustainable development, we have talked about having to have it involving integrated development, and it involves making a lot of policies. And when it comes to implementing policies, then we really need a lot of data. Yeah. So I'm wondering, as UN really invested when it comes to geospatial technologies, because I believe in the power of geospatial technologies, even when it comes to making decisions. And you find that with policies, mostly they fail when it comes to implementing them because there is normally the lack of data, accurate data, up-to-date data to make informed decisions. So as the UN invested in geospatial technologies, for making of informed decisions? in all the programs and initiatives it carries out towards sustainable development.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you very much. And it's a very interesting, important topic. Let me begin by saying that my agency, UNEP, has been asked by the Secretary General to develop the global environmental data strategy of the United Nations system. So by 2025, we will have a system-wide strategy for environmental data. This is also reflected in our what we call our medium-term strategy, which is a 4-year strategy that guides the work of the United Nations Environment Program. The next 4-year strategy, which is for the years 2022 to 2025, includes a new sub-program of our program of work. So we organize our work according to what are called sub-programs, because we are the United Nations Environment Program. So this sub-program is called Digital Transformation. And it is leading, in fact, on the development of the global environmental data strategy for the UN system. Digital transformation also addresses that are sweeping over the globe, transforming the global economy. And many of them are data-driven technologies. I'll give some examples. We have the Internet of Things, which is enabling the real-time monitoring and operation of objects in our world, of operating systems, helping us monitor temperature, monitor pollution, many factors, and even the performance and eco-efficiency of products. We have blockchain, which is distributed ledger technology. And blockchain allows us to authenticate both product claims, but also identities. So it enables things like smart contracting. And those reforms will change the way we do business. They are part of e-commerce, electronic commerce, and they will transform the employment markets of the world by cutting out the so-called middleman, although that's probably a gendered term. The middle person, the go-betweens between producers and consumers that often take a slice of the product, if you will, of the income generated by the product. Those industries are being transformed. We already see that in Kenya with financial service industry and the creation of transfer mechanisms like M-Pesa using telecommunications. So micro banking is another exploding area where technology is transforming how finance and banking is done. So there's a lot of this. I won't go through too many more examples, but there is a roadmap of the United Nations that was prepared this year for digital transformation under the aegis of the Secretary General's office. And we do expect this will be a major part of our work in the coming decade. It is radically changing employment and investment and also the operating systems, and potentially could support sustainable development, potentially, but we have to be careful because even data has an environmental footprint. Data server farms, the backbone of the internet, is forecast to consume up to 20% of global electricity supply in the coming years. So, that implies carbon footprint. And again, it feeds back into the rising temperatures of the planet. So data is not free, and it's not in all cases clean. It does have an environmental footprint. And so we need to use data wisely and efficiently. And so we get on balance gains to the 2030 agenda, gains to the sustainability and health of the planet, and not just treated as a free resource. There is no free lunch, I'm afraid. Everything comes at a price. Thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you that what like how the climate has changed in the present COVID time, in the pandemic. Because I have seen like pictures of Himalayas being seen from a very long distance. But at the same time, I even read articles where the polar ice caps have been melting very fast. So has the condition worsened or has the condition been good?
Okay, thank you for that question. We saw with the first national measures to slow the contagion that were taken last March, last April. We saw a significant slowdown in manufacturing and in trade, and alongside that, there were sharp decreases in greenhouse gas emissions. But that is not really a hopeful sign. Global economies in many parts of the world have snapped back. So, accompanying let's say 1/3 decline in economic activity in the second quarter of 2020, we've seen some regions like the United States, in the third quarter, their economy has come back 30%, for example. So on net, they're still facing a contraction in economic activity, but it is not nearly as sharp as it looked to be during the second quarter. And that means that the carbon loading was only temporarily slowed, but now it's creeping back. I also note that China's economy is growing positively again, maybe at a slower rate than it had been historically, not at 6 or 7% per annum, but more like 3 and 4% per annum, but nevertheless growing. And so on balance, although trade is down, employment is down, and manufacturing is down globally, it's not expected that this will address the challenge we have with the global carbon agenda, to achieve the Paris agreements that were signed in 2016, supporting the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the 2030 agenda. The planet has to, in the next 10 years, cut its greenhouse gas emissions in half. And that puts us on track over the next 20 years to achieve the 2050 target of becoming a carbon neutral economy globally. Why carbon neutral? Because if you continue to put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, you will continue to see rising temperatures with catastrophic consequences for ecosystems and for people. The Paris Agreement has the aspiration of capping global temperature rise, average temperature rise, at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. That's aspirational because there's a kind of fallback. Failing that, we'll try to cap it at a higher level some decades later. But just to keep temperatures within this 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, we need to cut our carbon in the next 10 years in half. And that someone far cleverer than I am did an analysis, and he said, if the COVID-induced reductions in greenhouse gases we saw in the first half of 2020, this year, if that level of reduction is continued for the next 10 years, we'll make that target. But no one is suggesting that we should have the kind of trauma in global economy that we experienced this year, 10 more years in a row. It's just not sustainable. That's not a strategy. That's a kind of despairing picture of what we need to do. No, we need to take positive action to cut our carbon emissions. We need to, revise the energy mix. So we are taking less petroleum out of the ground and using sustainable, renewable resources. And we need to reform our manufacturing and our consumption habits, patterns of consumption and production. But that will get us only to 2030. Now we need to cut again between 2030 and 2040 to stay within the Paris Agreement target. We have to cut our greenhouse gases again in half. So first decade, cut them in half. Second decade, again, cut that in half from that 2030 baseline. And we are highly confident at UNEP that we know which measures to take so we can make that 2030 target. We have all the tools we need now to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint, our carbon footprint, to meet that target by 2030. We do not know how we're going to meet it by 2040. We need innovation, and we need, imagination, and we need massive investment between now and 2040 if we're going to meet that second milestone. The hopeful sign is we have done this before as a planet. We have faced, what looked to be insurmountable or unmanageable challenges, and set our minds to work and our government policies to work, and then we've overcome those challenges, even though at the outset no one knows what the answer is. So that's kind of my global picture. We are fortunate in that we know what to do now, and we can do it over the next 10 years. We have to muster the will to do it again the 10 years after that, and again the 10 years after that to reach 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Good evening. I am Dr. Sai Saraswati from VIT University, Vellore, India. Happy to see you again in one more international webinar as a speaker. I joined in the last webinar. You made a very great discussion. Thanks for your views. And coming up to you, I have some my own experiences, and as well as some couple of questions for you. And I was connected towards the climate change, and I felt it like we stay in the Eastern Guard. It's very hard. Always the climate will be top the line. So it will be like 42 degree and 43 degrees Celsius. So then I started to work with BCF, and then we worked down together for Adopt a Tree program. And it was like 4,000 species of diversified plants we just gave it back towards the rural government school children's. And it was a very great experience where we had for afforestation is something a good solution for climate change. In this instant, I was thinking about the other case is, will the Kyoto Protocol and Montreal Protocol be merged? Or can we look for something, a new protocol for the climate change in near future with the SDG 13? Is it likely to just sit over there? Is it possible?
Forecasting multilateral environmental agreements is a risky business, but is within the purview of member states of the United Nations to either supplement the existing legal instruments like the UNFCCC, the Global Climate Treaty. And the means is, as you've suggested, it's actually to negotiate additional protocols. So we saw this, for example, with the Convention on Biological Diversity. Member states decided there was something missing from their legal toolkit, and they came up with a new protocol on benefit sharing of biological resources, which strengthened the natural capital of countries, keeping those resources and the benefits from them more within their control. So it has happened in the history of diplomacy that governments build on existing treaties by adding protocols. Whether there'll be an entirely new protocol, a new legal instrument, a new treaty, if you will, on climate, I don't have an opinion on that. I have not heard of momentum in that direction. But I think, to use an analogous field, in the field of chemicals and waste management, I could foresee new legal instruments being developed. After all, just recently, the Minamata Convention on Mercury was adopted as a wholly new legal instrument, unprecedented, because I don't think there'd ever been a treaty specifically on a metal as common as mercury. We had, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which addressed originally 12, and then the longer list of the Annex A and Annex B and Annex C pollutants. So baskets of chemicals that have been addressed by legal instruments. But now we have a treaty on just one, on mercury. It's extraordinary. So it is possible member states will conclude, as they learn more about the impacts of climate and heat and the ecology of the planet. The imagination is open. I would also, to come back to the earlier question about technology, I could foresee there will be legally binding instruments developed on data and information. We have treated data and information as an artificial product of commerce. We probably need to think about data as a natural resource, to see data and its flow as something that is inherent to how human ecosystems survive in an interconnected planet. So if I were to forecast where I think there may be in future, let's say in the next 10 years, a new legally binding instrument of law negotiated by the member states of the UN, data would be high on my list of a topic that might be addressed that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And you touched upon towards my other question regarding the BRS Convention and Stockholm Convention too. Thanks a lot. But the views towards the developing countries regarding towards the SDG 15, life on land, how it will work? So that's what I was thinking about it. Can you please give your views on it? Persistent organic pollutants.
There's many moving pieces in the intergovernmental system on this. To mention a couple, the Basel Convention on the Control of the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Wastes. The Basel Convention has recently adopted new text to deal with plastic waste, which is, I stopped working for the Basel Convention Secretariat in 2014, and certainly microplastic pollution was high on the policy agenda of the planet as a pollutant that is produced on land but is impacting the oceans. But I did not foresee in 2014 that the Basel Convention would come up with legal standards in this area, because plastic was not viewed in 2014 as a hazardous pollutant. Plastic was seen as relatively benign, which it's not. But it is interesting how quickly policy communities learn and can change their positions. And if you had asked me 5-6 years ago, would there be this advance, a ban amendment to the convention, which is what has come into force on plastics, I would not have forecast that. So to come back to land and life on land and SDG 15, another change in the intergovernmental systems approach has been the maturation of what's called the Global Program of Action for Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Sources of Pollution. GPA for short in UN speak. No one else speaks that way, but people in the UN, they love initials and acronyms. So this global program of action was instituted in, I think, 1995. So it's 25 years old. And it's probably maturing into a set of separate mandates given by the United Nations Environment Assembly, itself a fairly new product of intergovernmental work. The UN Environment Assembly is the governing body of UNEP, and it meets every 2 years, and it takes resolutions and decisions on what are the major environmental priorities. So I could see SDG 15 being the topic of future UN Environment Assembly decisions, and as it is also a topic under review by the high-level political forum on sustainable development, which meets annually in New York every July. So the high-level political forum keeps the SDGs under review, and UNEA, UN Environment Assembly, every 2 years reports on progress with implementing these decisions, resolutions, to support the 2030 agenda. So these two bodies are where the action is. Of course, there's specific multilateral environmental agreements on land, such as the Convention on Desertification. So that meets annually, and it addresses land use issues, land cover issues, the ecology of land. And there's the Global Landscape Forum, another 5-year project of the United Nations supported by the government of Germany that addresses these issues, like the ones we spoke of when we discussed the Great Green Wall Initiative, the reforestation of deserts. So yeah, it's a big topic, and I think there are forums that are making some progress on it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a great time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your detailed and elaborate explanations about the various aspects of sustainable development goals. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Michael.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Mr. Michael, I have Mr. Michael?
Yes.
Good evening, sir. The thing is that a small question. Can we expect this sustainable development in all the countries which are below the poverty line in a uniform manner? I mean to say, because since we are having a slow development in the below poverty line countries, can there be a uniform type of sustainable development in any aspect, like medical, any other aspect taking into consideration?
Yeah, the Secretary General, in an address given, Secretary General Guterres addressed the United Nations on the 17th of July, I believe, the anniversary of Nelson Mandela, the great human rights leader, of his birth. And in that address, the Secretary General spoke of inequality. And it's a powerful statement that we have not tackled sustainable development and inequality effectively. In the midst of the COVID pandemic, we have backslid. We have not only failed to address rising inequality and its impact on developing on the global south, in particular, and on the poor in many middle income and upper income countries, but we've actually lost momentum and slid back. So some of the statistics I mentioned earlier show that the conditions of the planet are worsening for the very poorest. But that said, the issue is high on the agenda now, because of the efforts of the Secretary General, because of the efforts of his office and of the committees. I mentioned the high-level committee on programs, which is a body of the UN Chief Executive Board, the chief executives of all UN agencies. They have their own committee and a secretariat, and they've convened a task team on inequality, on inequity, and there is high-level attention now to this aspect because it seems to be inhibiting the achievement of the 2030 agenda. That is, in a way, a sea change in how governments perceive issues of what used to be called distributional justice. Not are we creating enough wealth, but are we distributing the products of human ingenuity, human effort, the resources of the planet equitably? I'll mention another aspect of this changing perception of the importance of equality and inequality and equity, inequity. And that is the 6th Global Environment Outlook, which is UNEP, my agency's flagship report. We've only issued it 6 times since we were created nearly half century ago. And it is really the state of the environment report for the entire planet. It was last published in the 6th edition in 2019, in March of 2019, Cambridge University Press. And it is an extensive, deep study of the conditions of the planet and how the 2030 agenda could be realized if certain changes in policies and behaviors occurred. So I highly recommend that report. But why am I mentioning it now? It's not merely a report, but it is the state, the status of the environment, developed by over 200 experts, scholars nominated by member states, developed over a 2-year time. So, you know, it really deeply researched. And for the first time in this 6th GEO, Global Environment Outlook report, equity was thematized. It was incorporated as a cross-cutting issue. So there were a handful of cross-cutting issues, one being climate change, another being gender, and also now inequity, inequality, and how that influences environmental problems, challenges that we face as a globe. That's new. At one point during drafting, there were 75 references to equity in the report, in chapters that dealt with land management, for example. I worked on that chapter a little bit. I was an equity advisor to the GEO Secretariat. So I helped the authors of the report see that equity is an issue that has to be addressed in order to understand how policies and investments will impact ecosystems. Much like I'm trying to convey today, that we have to address poverty and inequality in order to be effective at protecting the planet's resources. We have to protect resources to tackle poverty. So it goes both ways. So I hope that helps. I can't forecast that that all countries will develop equitably, will benefit equally. That's beyond my power. But I do know the UN takes this very, very seriously, and it has been identified, as I've explained, at the highest level as a crucial factor for the 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Michael and Mr. Krishna Kishore. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you very much for your questions and your inspiration.
Yeah. Thank you for your wonderful presentations, and thanks, friends. On behalf of BCF India, I take this opportunity to thank today's speaker, Mr. Michael Stanley Jones. He is spending his valuable time during this lockdown for sharing his views on making sustainable development integrated approaches to achieving the 2030 agenda. The session was highly informative. We appreciate all our participants in participating in this international webinar. Thanks for all participants and today's speaker. Thank you, Mr. Michael. You gave a wonderful exposition for us.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you so much.